You're not going to that penthouse. Turn around before you embarrass yourself." The words echoed across the polished marble lobby just as the private elevator doors slid shut behind another group of elegantly dressed guests. Conversations faded into uneasy silence. Every head turned toward the man who had been stopped only a few steps from the entrance. Marcus Ellison didn't react the way Richard Hale expected. He neither argued nor raised his voice. Instead, he calmly lifted his eyes to the gold-plated sign above the elevator displaying a single word, Penthouse. His expression remained unreadable. Morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Whitmore Tower, reflecting against polished stone and bronze accents that announced wealth without saying a word. Luxury surrounded everyone inside the building, yet the atmosphere had suddenly become uncomfortable. Richard straightened his tailored suit jacket and folded his hands in front of him with practiced authority. "I'm asking you politely," he said, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. "This level is reserved for owners and invited guests." Marcus glanced briefly at the elegant watch on his wrist before returning his attention to Richard. "I have an appointment." Nothing more. Nothing less. Richard gave a quiet laugh, loud enough for nearby residents and visitors to hear. "So does everyone who walks in here hoping to get a look upstairs." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared among the crowd. Others exchanged uncertain glances, sensing the conversation had become something it shouldn't. Behind the reception desk, Sophia Reed paused while organizing visitor credentials. She looked from Marcus to the appointment screen in front of her, then back again. Something about the calm confidence in the stranger's posture didn't match the assumption forming around him. Marcus stood perfectly still. His charcoal polo and dark jeans were immaculate but understated, making him look more like an ordinary professional than someone accustomed to exclusive towers and private elevators. Richard interpreted the silence as hesitation. "I don't want security involved," he continued, lowering his voice just enough to sound courteous while ensuring everyone nearby could still hear. "If you're here by mistake, now's the time to leave." Marcus slowly reached into his pocket. Not for identification. Not for an argument. Only for his phone. Without the slightest trace of frustration, he unlocked the screen and looked toward the elevator one final time, as though he already knew something no one else in the lobby had yet begun to imagine. Marcus's thumb moved across the screen with deliberate calm. He tapped a single contact, lifted the phone to his ear, and waited. There was no urgency in his posture, no trace of irritation in his face. To everyone watching, it looked like the quiet surrender of someone who had finally accepted defeat. Richard Hale mistook the silence for exactly that. "There you go," he said with a satisfied nod. "Call whoever dropped you off. They'll save themselves another trip if they come back now." A few guests chuckled politely before looking away. Others avoided eye contact altogether, unwilling to become part of the uncomfortable exchange unfolding in the center of the immaculate lobby. Marcus never acknowledged the remark. The call connected. "I'm here," he said evenly. "Main lobby." Nothing more. He ended the call before the person on the other end could be heard. Richard raised an eyebrow. "That's it?" Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket. "That's enough." The answer only deepened Richard's confidence. He folded his arms and positioned himself directly between Marcus and the private elevator, as though guarding something priceless. Behind the reception desk, Sophia Reed quietly reopened the appointment schedule. Hundreds of names filled the system, but one entry immediately caught her attention. The reservation had no company logo attached, no apartment number, and no resident listed as host. Instead, it carried a discreet executive authorization code she had only seen once during her training. Her fingers hesitated above the keyboard. Could it be a mistake? She looked toward Marcus again. His eyes wandered across the lobby, taking in the architecture rather than the people staring at him. The towering glass walls reflected the morning skyline, while sunlight painted long shadows across the polished marble floor. He seemed remarkably familiar with the building, almost as if every detail belonged exactly where he expected it to be. Sophia's heartbeat quickened. She reached for the internal directory to verify the authorization, but before she could complete the request, Richard noticed her movement. "Don't waste your time," he said sharply without taking his eyes off Marcus. "There's nothing to verify." Sophia slowly lowered her hand. Marcus remained perfectly still. The lobby had grown unnaturally quiet. Even the concierge staff had stopped pretending not to watch. Somewhere above them, a private elevator began its silent descent. No one in the room realized that within moments, the balance of power inside Whitmore Tower was about to shift forever. The soft chime of the descending private elevator echoed through the lobby, but before anyone could turn toward it, Richard Hale took another deliberate step forward. "I'm going to make this perfectly clear," he announced, his voice carrying across the marble hall. "You are not entering that elevator today." His words landed with enough force to draw even more attention from residents waiting near the concierge lounge. Conversations faded completely. Several guests casually pretended to check their phones while watching the confrontation from the corners of their eyes. Marcus Ellison remained motionless. He met Richard's stare without hostility, almost as though he were allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it was meant to. "I've already told you," Marcus said calmly. "I have an appointment." "And I've already told you," Richard replied. "Appointments don't exist without confirmation." "They do." "Not today." Richard lifted his radio from his belt. "Lobby security, I need assistance at the private elevator." The request was delivered professionally, but its purpose was unmistakable. Sophia Reed felt her stomach tighten. She glanced once more at the executive authorization still displayed on her monitor. Every instinct told her something about this situation was wrong, yet Richard's certainty dominated the room. Challenging him publicly would only create a larger scene before she had verified the reservation. Two uniformed security officers appeared from the far end of the lobby, walking briskly but without urgency. Richard greeted them with the confidence of someone convinced he was protecting the building. "This gentleman refuses to leave after being denied access." The officers stopped several feet from Marcus. One of them spoke respectfully. "Sir, may we ask your reason for being here?" Marcus answered exactly as he had before. "I'm expected." Nothing else. The officers exchanged a brief glance. His voice was steady. His posture was relaxed. Nothing about him suggested aggression or deception. Before either officer could continue, the private elevator emitted another quiet tone. The polished bronze doors began to separate. Every eye in the lobby shifted toward the opening. Richard instinctively straightened his jacket, expecting another wealthy resident to step out and unknowingly confirm that he had handled the situation correctly. Instead, an older gentleman in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit emerged with measured confidence. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his presence alone commanded immediate respect from everyone nearby. The moment his eyes found Marcus, he stopped walking. For a heartbeat, the entire lobby stood perfectly still. Richard smiled politely, unaware that the next few seconds were about to unravel everything he believed he understood about the man standing in front of him. The older gentleman's gaze never drifted toward Richard. It remained fixed on Marcus. For a brief instant, surprise softened his composed expression before it gave way to unmistakable respect. Without saying a word, he resumed walking across the marble floor, his polished shoes echoing through the silent lobby. Richard stepped forward with a courteous smile. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," he said confidently. "Apologies for the interruption. We're handling a security concern." Harold Whitmore barely acknowledged him. His eyes stayed on Marcus, as though everyone else in the room had disappeared. "Marcus," Harold said warmly, I wasn't expecting you to arrive downstairs. Marcus offered a small smile. The elevator was occupied. Harold nodded, then noticed Richard standing squarely between them. A faint crease appeared on his forehead. Is there a problem? Richard answered before anyone else could speak. Nothing serious, sir. This gentleman claimed he had access to the penthouse, but we couldn't verify his appointment. I thought it best to prevent unauthorized entry. The lobby remained silent. Sophia looked from Harold to Marcus, then back to the executive authorization still glowing on her monitor. Her pulse quickened as the pieces finally began fitting together. Harold turned toward the reception desk. Miss Reed. Sophia immediately straightened. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. Would you mind checking the executive schedule one more time? Richard gave a restrained laugh. Sir, we've already established. Harold gently lifted one hand. I asked Miss Reed. The interruption was calm, almost effortless, yet it carried enough authority to stop Richard mid-sentence. Sophia's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. This time, she opened a restricted section she had hesitated to access earlier. A confidential authorization appeared, highlighted in gold. Her eyes widened. The reservation had not been made by an apartment owner. It had been entered directly through the chairman's executive office. She swallowed. Mr. Whitmore. Her voice was barely above a whisper. The authorization is valid. Richard's confident expression flickered for the first time. There must be another guest with the same name. Sophia slowly shook her head. No, sir. She looked directly at Marcus. The appointment specifically identifies Mr. Marcus Ellison. The word settled over the lobby like a sudden change in the air. Guests exchanged puzzled glances. The two security officers quietly stepped back, no longer seeing any reason to remain between Marcus and the private elevator. Richard forced an uneasy smile, searching Harold's face for reassurance that this was simply a misunderstanding. Instead, Harold looked at Marcus with quiet admiration. Please forgive the delay, he said. Everyone upstairs has been waiting for you. For the first time since entering Whitmore Tower, Marcus took a single step toward the private elevator. No one moved to stop him. Marcus stepped into the open space before the private elevator, but he did not enter. Instead, he stopped beside Harold Whitmore. The silence inside the lobby grew heavier than before. Every resident, every employee, and even the two security officers seemed reluctant to breathe too loudly, as though one careless sound might interrupt whatever was about to happen. Richard Hale forced another confident smile. I'm glad the appointment was confirmed, he said, attempting to recover the authority that had slipped from his grasp. We simply follow procedures to protect our residents. Harold slowly turned toward him. I appreciate good procedures. Relief briefly crossed Richard's face. Harold continued. But procedures are only valuable when they are applied with judgment. The words were spoken gently, yet they landed with unmistakable weight. Richard's shoulders stiffened. I made the decision based on the information available. Marcus finally spoke. And what information was that? Richard hesitated. You weren't on the resident list. I never claimed to be. You were dressed like someone attending an executive meeting. Marcus tilted his head slightly. And what does someone attending an executive meeting look like? Richard opened his mouth, but no answer came. The question lingered in the air, exposing the assumption he could no longer hide behind. Around them, several guests quietly lowered their eyes. Sophia remained at the reception desk, replaying every moment since Marcus had entered the building. She realized he had never demanded special treatment. He had never raised his voice, never mentioned his accomplishments, and never attempted to embarrass anyone. He had simply expected to be treated with the same respect given to every other visitor. Harold looked toward the security officers. Thank you, gentlemen. That will be all. Both officers nodded respectfully before stepping away. No one questioned the decision. Harold then faced Marcus. The board has already arrived upstairs. They refuse to begin without you. A faint murmur spread through the lobby. Several residents exchanged puzzled looks. The board? One guest whispered. Harold nodded without taking his eyes off Marcus. Our final investment meeting. Richard felt the color drain from his face. Investment meeting. The phrase echoed in his mind. He suddenly remembered the confidential notices circulated among senior staff over the previous month. Widmore Tower had been negotiating with a major investment group regarding an expansion that would redefine the entire property. The identity of the lead investor had been kept strictly confidential. Richard had assumed someone wealthy, older, and already well known in the city's real estate circles would arrive. He had never imagined the man standing only a few feet away. Marcus met Harold's gaze. I'd rather not keep everyone waiting. Harold smiled warmly. Neither would they. He stepped aside and, with a quiet gesture of respect, invited Marcus to enter the private elevator first. The bronze doors remained open, waiting. Behind them, the stunned silence of the lobby followed Marcus forward, while Richard stood rooted to the marble floor, beginning to realize that the meeting upstairs was far more than a business negotiation, and that the man he had judged within seconds might hold influence reaching far beyond the walls of Widmore Tower. The private elevator doors closed with a quiet whisper, leaving the stunned lobby behind. Inside, only Marcus Ellison and Harold Widmore stood beneath the soft recessed lighting. The ride upward was almost silent, interrupted only by the faint hum of the elevator ascending toward the highest floor of Widmore Tower. Harold exhaled slowly. I owe you an apology. Marcus looked ahead at the illuminated floor indicator. You don't. I do, Harold replied. No guest should be greeted the way you were. Marcus offered a faint smile. Your staff made a choice. That choice belongs to them, not to you. Harold nodded thoughtfully. The answer reflected exactly why he had spent months looking forward to this meeting. Every conversation with Marcus had reinforced the same impression: discipline before emotion, respect before authority. The elevator reached the penthouse level. As the doors opened, a spacious reception gallery came into view. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city's skyline stretching toward the horizon. Around a polished walnut conference table, a dozen executives, architects, financial advisors, and legal representatives immediately rose to their feet. Every conversation stopped. Good morning, Marcus, several voices said almost in unison. Marcus greeted them with a calm nod. Thank you for waiting. No one wanted to begin without you, replied one of the attorneys, with an appreciative smile. At the center of the room rested a detailed architectural model of Widmore Tower and the surrounding development. Beside it lay a collection of bound agreements, carefully arranged for final signatures. Harold walked to the head of the table, but did not take a seat. Instead, he addressed everyone present. I believe you've all met Mr. Marcus Ellison in previous negotiations. Today, we're here to complete what we've spent nearly a year building together. Marcus stepped beside the architectural model. The lead attorney opened the final agreement. All regulatory approvals have been completed, she announced. Funding has been verified, contractual conditions have been satisfied, and both parties are prepared to execute the transaction. One by one, the documents were placed before Harold and Marcus. Without ceremony, they each signed the final pages. The attorney reviewed the signatures, compared them against the prepared originals, and smiled. The transaction is officially complete. A quiet round of applause filled the room. Harold extended his hand. Congratulations, Marcus. Marcus accepted the handshake. Congratulations to all of us. Harold turned toward the executives gathered around the table. I'm pleased to introduce the new principal investment partner leading the next chapter of Widmore Tower. Every face in the room reflected confidence rather than surprise. They had known this outcome for months. Far below, however, the news had not yet reached the marble lobby. Richard Hale still stood near the private elevator, replaying every decision he had made that morning, unaware that the document signed several floors above had just transformed Marcus Ellison from an anticipated guest into one of the most influential figures connected to the future of Whitmore Tower. The applause gradually faded, but the significance of the moment lingered in the Penthouse conference room. Marcus Ellison gathered the signed agreements into a single folder and set them aside without the slightest display of triumph. Around the table, executives exchanged satisfied smiles. Months of negotiations had reached their conclusion, yet Marcus carried himself exactly as he had in the lobby below, calm, measured, and quietly confident. Harold Whitmore looked toward the panoramic windows before turning back to the group. "There is one more matter I'd like to address." The room fell silent again. He pressed a discreet button beside the conference table. "Please ask the lobby manager to come upstairs." Minutes later, the private elevator doors opened once more. Richard Hale stepped into the penthouse. His polished appearance remained unchanged, but his confidence had vanished somewhere between the lobby and the executive floor. He glanced around the room, recognizing attorneys, investors, and architects whose names regularly appeared in business journals. Every seat at the table was occupied by people whose decisions shaped projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Then he saw Marcus standing beside Harold. Neither man had moved. Richard instinctively slowed his pace. Harold welcomed him with a calm expression. "Mr. Hale, thank you for coming." Richard forced a professional smile. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore." Harold gestured toward the architectural model of Whitmore Tower. "The agreements you were unaware of this morning have now been completed." Richard nodded cautiously. "I understand," Harold continued. "As of a few minutes ago, Mr. Marcus Ellison has become the principal investment partner responsible for leading the tower's next phase of development." The words settled over Richard with unmistakable finality. He looked at Marcus again, this time without assumptions. Every conversation from the lobby replayed in painful detail. The dismissive remarks, the blocked elevator, the confidence with which he had judged someone he had never bothered to know. For several seconds, he could not find his voice. Finally, he stepped forward. His shoulders lowered. His posture softened. "Mr. Ellison." The title came naturally now. "I owe you a sincere apology." The room remained completely still. Richard continued quietly. "I made judgments before I had facts. I focused on appearances instead of treating you with the respect every visitor deserves. There is no excuse for that, and I regret my actions." Marcus studied him for a moment. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no desire to prolong the discomfort, only thoughtful silence. Harold watched without interrupting. Marcus finally extended his hand. Richard accepted it with both of his. "I appreciate your apology," Marcus said evenly. "Titles, clothing, and assumptions can all change in a single day. Character is revealed by how we choose to treat people before we know who they are." No one spoke after that. The lesson needed no further explanation. Even Harold lowered his head slightly toward Marcus, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect for the quiet strength that had transformed an embarrassing confrontation into a moment every person in the room would remember long after the contracts had been signed. Richard released Marcus's hand slowly, as though he understood that the gesture mattered far more than the apology itself. No one around the conference table applauded. No one spoke. The quiet that settled over the penthouse carried a different weight now, not embarrassment, but reflection. Harold Whitmore finally broke the silence. "I've managed this building for more than 30 years, he said, looking around the room. "I've invested in architecture, technology, and security. Yet today reminded me that the reputation of a building depends just as much on the people who welcome others through its doors. Several executives nodded in agreement. Harold turned toward Richard. This isn't about one mistake. Richard lowered his eyes. I understand. It's about the standards we choose every single day. Richard took a slow breath. I'd like the opportunity to earn back that trust. Harold studied him for a moment before giving a measured nod. That begins today. The conversation moved forward without anger, accusations, or public humiliation. Instead of assigning blame, Harold instructed the management team to review visitor procedures, emphasizing that professionalism required patience, verification, and respect before conclusions. Sophia Reed quietly observed the discussion from the side of the room. Earlier that morning, she had doubted her own instincts when she saw the executive authorization on her screen. Now she understood that paying attention to facts required courage, especially when assumptions seemed easier. Marcus noticed her thoughtful expression. You almost checked the authorization a second time, he said with a gentle smile. Sophia looked slightly embarrassed. I should have trusted what I saw. You'll have many moments like that in your career, Marcus replied. Never let someone else's certainty replace your own responsibility to verify the truth. She nodded, knowing she would remember those words far longer than the events of the morning. As the meeting concluded, the legal team carefully collected the executed agreements, while architects gathered around the development model to discuss the next phase of construction. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun with tension and misunderstanding ended with cooperation and renewed purpose. Harold walked beside Marcus toward the private elevator. The future of this tower looks different now, he said. Marcus smiled modestly. So should the way people are welcomed into it. The elevator doors opened. Before stepping inside, Marcus glanced back across the conference room. Richard was speaking respectfully with the security officers, thanking them for handling the situation professionally. Sophia had already begun updating the visitor protocols on her computer. The executives had returned to discussing plans for the tower's expansion, but the lesson from the morning remained present in every conversation. As the elevator descended, Marcus looked through the glass wall toward the city below. Buildings could be renovated. Businesses could grow. Policies could be rewritten. But lasting change always began with the simple decision to see another person with dignity before making assumptions about who they were. The following morning, Wigmore Tower looked exactly as it had the day before. The marble floors still reflected the morning sun. The private elevators still carried residents and guests to the highest floors. The skyline beyond the glass walls had not changed. Yet for the people inside the building, something unmistakably had. Richard Hale arrived earlier than usual. Before his first meeting, he walked through the lobby, stopping at the reception desk where Sophia Reed was reviewing the newly approved visitor procedures. Good morning, he said. Sophia looked up and smiled politely. Good morning. Richard glanced at the updated welcome guidelines displayed on her screen. Every guest would now be verified through the reservation system before assumptions were made. Employees were encouraged to ask questions with courtesy, not suspicion. Respect had become the first step of every interaction, not the reward after someone's status had been confirmed. It should have always been this way, Richard admitted quietly. Sophia nodded. I think everyone learned something yesterday. Neither of them needed to mention Marcus's name. The lesson remained present without it. Several weeks later, construction planning for Wigmore Tower's expansion officially began. Architects, engineers, and investors filled the Penthouse conference room almost every day. Marcus Ellison attended many of those meetings, but he continued arriving the same way he always had, wearing simple business attire, greeting every employee by name, and thanking the reception staff before heading upstairs. Nothing about his success had changed his character. If anything, it revealed it more clearly. New employees often assumed he was another consultant or project manager until someone quietly introduced him. Marcus never corrected anyone immediately. He simply allowed people to treat him the way they naturally chose. Most greeted him with professionalism. A few learned valuable lessons. One afternoon, Richard watched Marcus pause to help an elderly visitor who had become confused while looking for the correct elevator. Marcus carried the gentleman's portfolio, walked him to the proper floor, wished him a pleasant meeting, and continued on his own way without mentioning who he was. Richard smiled to himself. Months earlier, he would have overlooked a moment like that. Now he recognized it as leadership. Not the kind written on a business card. The kind demonstrated when no recognition was expected. As the tower's redevelopment moved forward, Harold Whitmore often reflected on the morning Marcus had been stopped in the lobby. The investment agreements had strengthened the future of the building, but the greatest improvement had not appeared on architectural drawings or financial reports. It appeared in everyday conversations. Employees listened more carefully. Residents greeted unfamiliar faces more warmly. Questions replaced assumptions. Respect arrived before judgment. Late one evening, Marcus stood alone beside the penthouse windows overlooking the city lights. Thousands of illuminated buildings stretched across the skyline, each filled with people carrying stories no one else could fully see. Harold joined him quietly. "I've spent my life believing buildings shaped cities," he said. Marcus smiled as he looked across the horizon. "They do." He paused before continuing. "But people shape the buildings." Harold nodded, understanding the difference. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, indifferent to titles, wealth, or appearances. Every morning, strangers would continue meeting strangers. Every first impression would still offer a choice: to judge or to understand. Marcus had never needed to prove he belonged inside Whitmore Tower. He had simply carried himself with a dignity no one else could give him, and no one could take away. Because true influence is never measured by the floor you reach, the title you hold, or the doors that open for you. It is measured by the respect you show others before you know their story. And sometimes, the most powerful person in the room is the one who never needs to announce it.